I need a W in my life, and so does everyone else.
It's not a strong basis to build a counter-hegemony, taking L after L after L.
What's Left of Philosophy. I'm Gil. Here with me today is William, Lillian, and Owen. Hey, guys.
Hey.
Hey, everyone.
Hey.
For today's episode, we are discussing Antonio Gramsci's book, The Modern Prince. Listeners may remember that a few months back, we did a fun little New Year's special where we talked about Gramsci's essay, I Hate New Year's Day. But now we're going to take him a little bit more seriously. Gramsci was born in Sardinia in 1891 and spent most of his short life working as a socialist organizer, politician, and journalist. He established the weekly paper L'Ordine Nuovo and was a founding member and active leader within the Italian Communist Party. He also played a key role in the Third International in Moscow and Vienna. We should recognize that he was quite successful politically. He was actually elected to the Italian parliament in 1924. And in 1926, at a national conference, a majority of the PCI was won over to Gramsci's positions. But 1926 was also the year that the fascists, consolidating power under Mussolini, whom Gramsci was an outspoken critic of, had him arrested. Famously, at his trial, the prosecutor pointed directly at Gramsci and declared that, quote, "We must stop this brain from functioning for 20 years. They convicted him on 6 charges of treason, and he would spend the rest of his life in jail. He died in prison 11 years later. Now, they may have locked him up, but the fascists utterly failed at stopping that brain from functioning. During the last 10 years of his life, he produced what we now call the prison notebooks, some 3,000 pages of political theory, historical analysis, philosophical reflection, and cultural criticism. In these works, he contributed substantially to the development of modern Marxist theory. I'm going to say a few words about his contributions in general first, and then turn toward The Modern Prince to set up our conversation. Perhaps his most significant general contribution is his theory of cultural hegemony. Gramsci thought that classical or orthodox Marxism, represented by our old friend Karl Kautsky, was overly economistic. That is, the supposed orthodox position is that economic relations, sometimes referred to as the base or the structure of society, are fundamentally determinative of everything that happens in a given society, up to and including the question of revolution. On this picture, people's consciousness is directly determined by the level of development of economic relations, and whether they remain satisfied within society or find themselves storming the Bastille is a matter of strict economic necessity. Now, I think this is probably an unfair way to characterize even the most ardent proponents of what we call orthodox Marxism, but in any case, it's certainly not correct. Things are just much more complicated than that. There's no such thing as a homogeneous, singular level of economic development within any given society, which will often exhibit uneven development internally, and national integration within world economic systems leads to even more complex relations of uneven and combined development. People of all kinds of economic positions can develop very different degrees of critical consciousness, from the most reactionary to the most progressive and revolutionary. There just is no simple one-directionality that leads from the economic base to the superstructure, and any politics that assumes such a thing is going to land either in fatalistic defeatism or the naive optimism of an automatically assured revolutionary victory. Moreover, superstructural features such as cultural expressions, norms and values, and ideological formations, as Gramsci sometimes puts it, can sometimes react back on the base. The development and propagation of certain beliefs and attitudes can directly affect the state of the relations and forces of production. There sometimes is more direct economic determination, but Gramsci notes that this is often determination, quote, in the last instance, a sort of last resort mobilized when the functioning of cultural hegemony fails and military or police power cannot maintain social order. Cultural hegemony refers then to the way in which the ruling class utilizes ideological means to maintain consensual domination. Hegemony is actively constructed, not an automatic feature that arises spontaneously on the basis of political and economic domination. But it is, in many cases, an important condition for the possibility of maintaining that domination. This concept has been extraordinarily fruitful in sociology and cultural studies, in which, following Gramsci, it's used to analyze the relationships between ideological forms and political and economic power. One way to get at the significance of this idea is that it helps articulate a certain dialectical inseparability of thought and practice. It's not viable to think of these as abstractly separated. Intellectual activity is part and parcel of the construction and contestation of ideological hegemony through which political power functions and is reproduced. Beliefs are material forces. The question of what the state of affairs on the ground is, the question of so-called effective reality, must include an account of dominant ideas. Moreover, a political party needs to establish counter-hegemonic ideological consistency among its members and more broadly throughout society if it hopes to unseat those in power. This brings us to The Modern Prince. The short book, of course, refers to Machiavelli, and Gramsci presents his reflections as an updating of his Italian predecessor's realist political philosophy for present-day socialist purposes. The Modern Prince is, for Gramsci, the political party, which intervenes into a complex field of forces in order to try to gain and maintain political power. For this, again, cultural hegemonic construction is necessary. Moments of crisis are opportunities that need to be articulated discursively and integrated within an increasingly comprehensive worldview. The book is a profound reflection on critical strategy for the sake of advancing a realist socialist politics. Gramsci writes, quote, "The decisive element in every situation is the force, permanently organized and pre-ordered over a long period, which can be advanced when one judges that the situation is favorable. Therefore, the essential task is that of paying systematic and patient attention to forming and developing this force, rendering it ever more homogeneous, compact, and conscious of itself." End quote. Gramsci's theory of cultural hegemony and his identification of the political party as a crucial vector in the project of building socialism leads him to develop a detailed account of the moral and intellectual role of party leadership, which needs to advance a program for the reform of consciousness, no less than it needs to advance a program for the coordination of physical force. At the same time, Gramsci argues that the modern prince needs to be attuned to the actual needs and desires of the working masses, operating according to a principle of democratic centralism, refusing the authoritarian centralism exemplified by Stalin's rule. There are a lot of other features of the work. I'm just going to mention two things. First, Gramsci constantly insists on the role of passion and the will in politics. There is no, quote, objective analysis of political relations. There is political objectivity only in and through the impassioned analysis of a partisan. Social and political understanding without passion is not just rudderless, it is, Gramsci thinks, actually impossible. It's not even that there's a moral imperative to take a side, there's an epistemic imperative to do so. And this ties into the second point. The situations that it falls to us to analyze in the name of political strategy are irreducibly complex. There is not a single situation that Gramsci analyzes that doesn't involve 3, 4, 5 competing groups, each of which is internally inconsistent, forming provisional alliances and seeking to accomplish incompatible aims. In all cases, they're related, but in shifting contingent ways to the economic sphere, which itself is in constant development and flux. And the passion that animates our analysis of effective reality is part of that effective reality as well. So Gramsci doesn't give us many easy answers, I don't think, but I take this to be a feature of the realism of his analytic sophistication, not a defect at all of his thinking. So with that, I kind of wanted to toss it all to you guys. What did you think of this text? How'd you find it?
Yeah, I'll start. I think the first thing I was surprised about, and I'd like to hear what you all think, is I cannot quite tell if this text is really about Machiavelli's The Prince or if it's just an occasion for Gramsci to work out what it is he wants to say about politics. But, that being said, it seems, one of the innovations he's trying to introduce is, while for Machiavelli, the individual figure of the prince was the sort of center and motive force of politics, he now wants to say it's the party that's responsible for changing the balance of forces in the political arena. And so what I thought was interesting here is that Gramsci is struggling with can he develop a notion of the party that doesn't look like an authoritarian party and yet also does not disavow that there must be leaders and the led. And so partially it seems to be what he's trying to figure out is, so what it could be the productive relationship between leadership and those who are led that actually leans towards what he calls democratic centralism rather than bureaucratic centralism. I admit, and I'd be interested to hear what you all say, I see that he's making a distinction there. Can he actually hold that distinction, I guess, might be the question I have. So what would be the criteria by which we would know the difference between the party that animates democratic centralism rather than the party that, represses the movement towards socialism through bureaucratic centralism?
Well, I mean, I would just say on the connection to Machiavelli, I think that, okay, it's true. You go sometimes 20 pages in this text, and it's not that long of a text. And you're like, wait, where's the Machiavelli stuff again? But I think the ultimate connection is on the question of realism. I think he thinks Machiavelli's the fundamental contribution of Machiavelli to political philosophy and to philosophy is a conception of realism, which is very different than other conceptions of realism, because he thinks it's a conception of realism that is based on the notion that you can only ever illuminate or disclose the realities of the social field from a partisan vantage point, right? From the vantage of having a program, as he puts it, right? It's only from within, we're used to thinking in a kind of, I don't know, maybe overly general kind of way, that what it means to be a realist is to be impartial and neutral and objective in the way that you perceive a situation or perceive a certain line of historical continuity. And, I think what he sees in Machiavelli, and that he thinks, this is what I think is his almost, epistemological claim, is that that's actually not how knowing works best. I mean, knowing works best when it's partisan, both because of, Gil, what you mentioned, the point about passion. What does he say that the language he uses is not looking at the world through dead eyes or something, having, yeah. And also because the field of forces, historical forces, social forces, is incredibly complex and vast. And I've made this point, I think, similarly in other podcasts, but one needs a way in order to intelligibly make sense of what you're trying to explain. You need a principle of selection, you need whatever. So yeah, I think whatever. I think there was a lot more in what you said than that, but I just wanted to say on the first point that he wants to advance a conception of realism as both a theoretical research program and as a practical political orientation. Yeah, I think that's what he gets from Machiavelli.
What do you think realism means here in this case?
In the case of Gramsci? Yeah, I think it means, so, he alludes at one point to this double perspective, right? That you don't just see objective reality, but you see subjective forces as also part of the lay of the land. And that making sense of those two forces requires also understanding yourself as a force and having the desire to be a force, wanting to be a force in that situation too. So for him, realism, maybe I guess it's better to say it has three components, right? There's to be a realist is to, he says on many occasions, right, that look, economic analysis, again, I would put it more kind of cold stream economic analysis is necessary. An understanding of where people's heads are at, to put it really crudely, is also really necessary. Understanding cultural force is also really necessary. And then this third thing, who you are, what you want to see out of your analysis, what you want your analysis to do, what you want your thinking to do, what you want to happen in the world, and also it's also a third kind of ingredient in realism. I love that conception of realism. I think that's legit to me. Like, I like that.
Yeah, I mean, something that like stood out to me in this text wasn't really the culture stuff, to be honest. It was what a sense that Gramsci had that it was his fault if people didn't do what he wanted them to do. And to be honest, maybe it's just been a long day, but I had this like sinking feeling reading this again, because I just think we lack this almost entirely. There is a generation of the left that thought that if people didn't agree with them, if they voted the way that they didn't want them to vote, or if they didn't agree with their slogans, or if they didn't see what they wanted them to see, that it was their fault. And when they lost to the right, they blamed themselves. And they said, what did we do wrong? And how did we lose our base? And I just, I think that's what he's trying to figure out, that kind of self-reflective moment where he says, you have to understand the social content of the masses who adhere to the movement. What function do they have in the balance of forces? To what effective needs do their aims correspond? And then you examine those means to a proposed end. And I take it that that's the realism part. But as far as I can tell, I feel like what we mostly do today is like blame people for not agreeing with us. If people don't agree, if people don't see what we see, we don't ask ourselves what we're doing wrong. And we almost find it to be an insult when people tell us that they don't see it. And so there was, and I think part of the difference is in this generation and what we're living with now is, I don't know, the sense that their actions really had stakes. They had a sense of their own power, and we feel powerless, and therefore the only thing we can do is cry when people don't do what we want them to do. And when your political behavior, when it actually has stakes, when you can see that your actions actually have concrete outcomes, that's when the moralism stops, because moralism, it's a symptom of powerlessness, and I don't know. It's almost like people have been talking about this culture part of Gramsci for so long that I kind of feel like the big picture, like the totally different energy that he has about politics, just gets lost in that kind of analytical back and forth about base and superstructure or whatever. In a way, reading this made me feel like it was totally besides the point. It's a totally different ethos. It felt alien to me when I kind of stopped reading it for the cultural hegemony angle, which is, I think, how people normally read it. I don't know if that makes sense to you guys.
Yeah, I know. I first encountered him in a cultural studies class, and when I read this book a while back, and I like this is a top tier. I love this text like so much. No, seriously, and yeah, I mean, I was struck immediately that how different this was than the Gramsci I encountered in undergraduate cultural studies classes. And I just feel like he's at pains in this little book to say that, in emphasizing the role of ideology or of culture or whatever, I don't want people to replace economism with what he calls ideologism.
Ideologism, yeah.
Ideologism, right? Where
for culture,
and everything becomes about competing ideologies and cultural criticism and showing up the limits of ideology, basically what a lot of what cultural critique does, and a lot of it's really good. But let's just be crass for a second. Like the stuff that sucks, which tends to, just be like, I'm going to show you how look at this ruse at work here. Capitalism is playing a culture trick here. It's like trying to get you to just repeat certain behaviors that are favorable to it or whatever. And that just is I'm not saying it doesn't have any place in what he pictures as revolutionary practice, but it's so marginal that's wild that it became so central.
Well, to build off those 2 points, I think what's central to the text, and I guess the way that I try to work through, what Gramsci's trying to do with the party and this distinction between democratic centralism and bureaucratic centralism, is Gramsci's trying to develop a type of analysis and ethos of leadership. Of if you are the ones who take yourselves, to use Lillian's language, to be responsible for trying to introduce some sort of change into the world, what Owen's calling you, that that sort of passion, then, it's important that you understand something like this. If you are a leader, then, what is the type of relationship you're going to have with the ones you are trying to lead? He uses this fascinating example of, soldiers being able to deal with being, starved and all of that if it's because an act of God prevented, food from reaching the front line. But as soon as it's about, even if it's only for one day, a dysfunctional bureaucracy that doesn't make the correct choices, and then they revolt. And so it's quite clear that I guess what's specific about this text, and I'll say what's specific about this text and maybe, what might be different about our particular moment, is Gramsci really thinks it is possible to have, leaders who have some sort of effectivity in the world. And he thinks that leadership looks something like the party. The question I would have for us now is, do we have those same type of parties here now in the 21st century? I don't know if we have time to get into it, but, Gramsci is responding to, historical. Okay.
Yeah, no.
Well, fair enough. But okay. I'll
The
say
end.
it, and then,
Episode over.
we'll log off. Gramsci's dealing with a particular set of political problems in Italy. Now, what are our parties like? And, to kind of, again, drawing from Lillian and Owen, it does seem to me that even the analysis of, what leaders ought to be like, what the relationship should be, that's now at an ebb. And, maybe there's more of an emphasis on, there should be leaderless movements or horizontal movements, or the problem is actually with the led rather than the leaders, which is a way of actually letting current political parties off the hook. And so it just strikes me that, Gramsci's writing in a very different historical space. I want to be careful and say, I have no idea what Gramsci would say if he was alive in the 21st century, if he'd hold on to this notion of the party. But at least, I think, what would be interesting to talk about is, why he thinks the party is a reliable organ for social transformation. And a way to think about that is to compare it with the parties that we have now, which are, parliamentary parties or in two-party system that seem less and less able to, have that active role that, Gramsci is describing.
Yeah, I'm really glad we made it back to the other part of the point you made at the beginning, because one way it seems to be that he wants to answer this is to say that a party, because he uses the party in different senses that I found confusing at certain times, right? Sometimes he uses the party in extremely expansive sense that isn't just what we would think of as a parliamentary, like, political party, but as everything, including a whole movement, has some kind of organic connection with labor unions and with or with labor in general. And so I think it's really that whatever he understands, and this part I don't have a great grasp on, but there's some kind of connection that the party he has in view has to both labor, to social movements, to culture, to all these different facets of society at large. And that, I think, he thinks really fundamentally distinguishes it from both a kind of party in a bourgeois parliamentary order and a party in what he considers an overly bureaucratized socialist order. But again, that's I think that's how I would state the difference. But they would want to claim, obviously, they do have some organic connection with all these, they have a kind of social base, that they have connections to culture. So no party stands up there and is like, we're a party that is totally abstracted from the society we represent.
We float above society. We're an idea.
We float above society. Yeah, exactly. So
I think he's talking about the Revolutionary Party, no?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think he's a pretty orthodox Marxist on this. I think he's talking specifically about the Revolutionary Party, and he's entering these debates about the relationship between that party and the class. And that's the only way it makes sense to me, because that's the only debate about that exists at this time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not, there is a parliamentary arm of the Revolutionary Party, I guess, but usually revolutionary parties, they have various relationships with parliamentary organizations. Yeah. And I think otherwise it just doesn't make sense to me why he would be talking about democratic centralism and so on. I think this is just my interpretive thing. I'm not a Gramsci expert or anything. Sometimes I think people try to get a lot more creative with this than it is, and it kind of loses the grounding intuitions that motivate this. And it makes a lot more sense if you see him as a basically pretty orthodox dude who is trying to figure out the relationship between the Revolutionary Party and the class. Otherwise, I feel like it's a little conceptually inflated and ambiguous, and the leader is in the lead, the party in the class. He doesn't like use the language of like the most advanced elements of the class, but in the Third International, that's what they were talking about. And I think there's something about Gramsci that lends itself to any and all interpretation. So I think, someone could just be like, no, Lillian, he's reinventing the idea of the party as we speak, but there's a way in which the text kind of falls into place to me if you kind of assume that is indeed what he means. And then there's even like a kind of a Trotskyist element to this. Like he has like the so-called permanent revolution over and against the revolutionary democratic dictatorship. That's kind of him positioning himself in the Third International against a certain wing of the Bolshevik party and so on, if that makes sense.
So what do you take him to think that he's adding to the notion of the revolutionary party? Like what do you take him to think, what do you think he thinks he's adding that hasn't just been said?
When is this text written? I think that would be important for me.
I spent so long trying to figure it out, between 29 and 34, I think. It's all I could find.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, so he's dealing with the kind of the aftermath of Lenin's death, I'm sure. He's dealing with, the kind of onset of the impact of the way the party is starting to kind of congeal around the new economic policy, and the question about bureaucracy. Like I would think he's talking about Russia, and then he's dealing with the way that the German and the Italian parties are ossifying in the face of they're losing. I mean, I think this is kind of what's complicated about this period of time, is that after, we did the Lenin episode on state and revolution, after 1921 in Germany, and I think if this is at the end of the 20s, the 20s are a decade in which, the left is like fighting the right tooth and nail, but the revolutionary moment is past. They are losing and they're on the defensive, and we all know how this turns out.
Yeah.
So he's trying to figure out how to turn that ship around. Like that's what I think is happening.
Yes.
I'll think more about what's new, but I think that's like the motivation for it.
Can I just say I love that so much about him relative to other Marxists who write and think a lot about culture. I mean, granted that the Frankfurt School folks were after, the Second World War, so a little bit different of a context, but like he looks at these defeats or impending defeats that he's worried about and is trying to think about strategy and tactics, about like in his language, a strategic plan, propaganda and agitation, the science of organization, administration and politics. Like his response is not like a diagnostic of how culture like made everything, or how other forces other than just economic forces like made the revolution fail or makes it impossible or whatever. But there's something about that spirit of optimism, the pessimism in theory and optimism of the will or whatever. I don't even know if that's actually him, but there's just something that I really dig in that.
I mean, there certainly is a sense in which Gramsci is not the person who's saying something like, let's explain all the reasons why we can't win, why we haven't won, and why we won't win. He's not...
This is what we need to do to win.
Yeah, he's not looking at culture, because you could see a type of leftist critique that looks at culture to explain why actually political transformation is impossible. That people are, they're so fucked up, they're so lost in commodity fetishism, ideologies, etc. But he thinks, no, the point of the party is to assess those internal contradictions and find their way through them, to do what it can to remold the social field so that people can think and act their way towards freedom. And so if the party isn't doing that, then, that is, as kind of Lynn was saying in the beginning, that's on the party. That's not on culture messed us up.
Yeah.
I like that point a lot.
Yeah. It's also, this is like where part of the question, is of like what the vocation of leadership is. And like I said, there's an active positive project that this sort of diagnostic produces, or like which it engenders, having to do not with, again, like, I don't know, lamenting the state of culture or ideological mystification, but rather taking active steps toward constructing a counter-hegemonic cultural form. Or like, this is why agitprop is important. It's not just about getting people to knock doors or whatever. It's about changing the material effectivity on the ground of like what people's beliefs and dispositions are. He thinks that that's like something that you gotta do. And, you know, it must have been demoralizing to see fascism consolidate power so effectively in the Italy of his day. And
Oh my
I
God.
think there's like, you know, parallels we can draw with contemporary far-right movements. Obviously not quite so successful, but still, this stuff is possible through cultural manipulation as much as anything else. That doesn't require a defeatist posture. It requires an active strategic one. And I see him trying to figure out that. And again, I do like your question, Will, though, too, about like how do you do that without it becoming weird top-down authoritarianism? Because because I don't like the leaderless movement stuff that's so popular these days. The like emphasis on like
days for the past 40 years, man.
yeah, this okay, sure, it's fine.
Oh shit! Going back that far, yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I
that
think it seems bad to me, like strategically.
Yeah, CLR James set me straight on that shit.
I mean, listen, like the thing that really stands out to me, I think that's why I kind of like have this like for some reason, like I really like this text. It just brought out this somber tone for me, because what I mean is like I think Gramsci is like the opposite of Schmittian politics. It's not about a friend-enemy distinction. It's about how to figure out who should be your enemy and how to make the people that shouldn't be your friends. And if you don't figure that out, it is on you. And I don't know how to explain like how he must have felt the gravity of that problem in his moment. And we have a lot of very serious problems right now, but it seems like in a way we don't actually feel the gravity of that responsibility. We seem to like feel the gravity of like moral urgency, but not our own responsibility. And that's something that I think that's a part of the real politic of it. I guess that it's helpful what Owen said, where you figure out that the judgment to make is who should be your friend. What you need to do is make them your friend. And that's what it means to build hegemony. And that's what, that's what the capitalist class does. They do it implicitly, they do it explicitly. They figure out, and they have the means and ability to figure out who they want to be on their side and in what way. It's easier for them and it's harder for us. And I think Gramsci, he saw it falling apart. And that's why there's a lot of like post-Gramscians. I'm not anti-Gramsci. I want this to be clear. I respect Gramsci a lot. But there's a lot of post-Gramscians that kind of like see him as the answer to like what was collapsing about the left. But I think it's like really important to understand that it is a symptom of the collapse. It's a theory that's like, it's a cautionary tale. It's not just he got culture and how important it is to change hearts and minds. I know no one here is saying that. That really is honestly what it sounds to me like people take away from this.
Yeah.
It's also certainly the case that like a lot of post-Gramscian like cultural studies will I think here, for instance, of like a Zizek who's like totally down this rabbit hole where it like, I don't know, man. I don't know how important it is that like we have decaf coffee. Like, why aren't we talking about relations of production? You know what I mean? Like
that's because you don't understand the lack at the heart of the real of being. But
go
God
off. Yeah, no, but I do mean like, there's a real hard-nosed materialism in his insistence on analyzing the specificity of like relations and forces of productions and the sort of equilibria and disequilibria that it generates. He says at one point, like, we have a question here. Does like economic crisis produce critical consciousness and revolutionary action? And he's like, it's just an opportunity. It's only ever just an occasion, and one that we have an obligation to seize if we actually think. He does talk about Machiavelli in a few places. Right at the start of the text, he's like, it is rare. It's weirdly rare, but he says right at the beginning of the text, right? He's like, Machiavelli's The Prince is like a living document because he was trying to actually make change. He wanted to effectuate a shift in like the state of affairs. It's not just like I don't know, like what can we contrast it with? Like Locke's Second Treatise of Government or something where it's like, that's not trying to create something, right? In Machiavelli, he thinks was, and any socialism worthy of the name has to be that as well, right? The alternative to which is just, I don't know, like, I think you're right, Lillian, in a lot of ways, right? There's so much just like crying and not doing anything.
Well, there's an interesting implicit, I think.
Okay, now you lifted my spirits.
There's an interesting, I think, implicit distinction going on in Gramsci's book here, and it's and as far as I could track it, I think he is a bit ambivalent, but, I'll make it a hard and fast distinction between, the idea of politics as a science and politics as an art. And I think he worries that politics as a science leads to this sort of a formulaic approach where you either think, a crisis will just create the critical revolutionary consciousness, or it's this kind of dispassionate view of the social totality that doesn't take oneself as being a participant in it. But, the reason why I think it's interesting that he in places, again, he's not entirely consistent with it. And I'm going to cut him some slack. My dude, he was in prison by this time, right? Like,
yes,
okay, he didn't have Wikipedia on hand and all of that.
No, and by the by, like, a lot of these texts from a lot of the prison notebooks text have been like translated in a double sense, not just from Italian, but also from like the code that he had to write in because the fascists were like looking it over, and like, so he starts like using all like these like ciphers and ways of talking about Marxism without saying Marxism, stuff like this.
He's communing with Machiavelli, who also went to prison.
Oh, yeah. Spiritual partnership there.
Noted that Agamben is one Italian who didn't go to prison.
Wow. Really? Just like...
I thought he went to prison, isn't it? No, whatever.
Agamben?
I thought so. Oh, I'm thinking of Negri. Never mind.
Okay, I was about to say, but
yeah,
also...
No, Negri went to prison, yeah.
Okay,
the Italians
critical
go to prison.
hit on the Agamben there.
Massive. It's just an unbelievable L for
I can't wait till we do an Agamben episode.
Such a bad look.
But what I think is interesting with him, he'll use the term art. And why I think that's important is, and this isn't me just trying to link back to our aesthetics episodes or anything like that, but it's not me doing that, is he thinks that it's a skill to do politics. That if you think the way to do politics is read Machiavelli and then just do whatever Machiavelli says, even Gramsci doesn't think that. That's why I kind of made the joke of it is about Machiavelli's The Prince, but it's not. Gramsci is he's using this as an occasion to try to situate what Machiavelli could tell him in his particular conjuncture. And so, when we're talking about relationships between leader and the led, I think something that's really difficult is developing productive relationships between leadership and those who are being led is not easy. And it's not a skill that, someone just, knows how to do. And so what he's also talking about is a party needs to learn how to become creative within the situation in which they find themselves and learn how it is to create, or what he calls a sort of organic movement of politics. I wonder if in our moment, we really have, many of us have lost whatever this art of politics is that Gramsci is describing. And so we lean on, and I'm using we in the expansive sense, if you don't do this, don't worry, you're built different, et cetera, et cetera. But, we lean a lot on moralisms and slogans and chastising and all of that. And so, we can say that those are annoying people, and they are, but I also think that they are fundamentally people who don't know how to do politics. And so they look for easy formulas, easy solutions, and Gramsci's trying to say, but that's not, if politics is a space of these dynamic forces and tension and contradiction, then you're not going to get a one-size-fits-all solution. And I think that's what kind of goes back to Lillian's point about making them your friends. I mean, the four of us, we're really nice and popular. It's not always easy making friends. Like, there isn't just one thing you do in order to win people over into what you're trying to do. And so I think that distinction
Did
between...
you just say you were popular?
Well, I mean, I said all four of us were, but yes. Me? Are you kidding me?
Will's
People love me. Unless it's a Phenon episode, then they fucking hate me.
Notably popular man Will.
But yeah.
Yeah, unless I talk about art. Then
yeah, exactly. We're popular in particular conjunctures, okay?
Exactly. But just on your point, Will, I think again, this is what he's really drawn to in Machiavelli is that he says this at one point, like, what Machiavelli did was to try to study politics, not morality in politics, not like the ethico-political, whatever, but politics as an independent sphere of investigation.
Lillian loves this.
And in politics, he's like, this is what he loved about Machiavelli. You have to, like, if you're going to be effective, And he thinks this is a lesson that needs to be reiterated clearly when he's writing this in, between 29 and 34. If you're going to be effective, you got to fucking put the moralism to bed. Like, you cannot be
it's not
moralistic
political
or whatever.
I mean, that is
it's politics. It's fucking politics. It's about relations of forces. You find out who you got to make friends with to be successful, and it doesn't matter what they like, what moral scruples you have about it. Okay, I'm being a little bit extreme or whatever, but like
the hyperbole makes the point. I think
again, that's the ethos in Machiavelli that I think he's super drawn to.
And this is, I think, why like the party has such an outsized significance, right, in this moment. Like, if again you're serious about affecting the field of forces and making a change, you need an organ, you need like a body capable of organizing, homogenizing, concentrating, and wielding like force, right? Actually,
we're being distracted by Owen's adorable daughter.
I didn't mean. I'm trying to distract her with the visual of you guys. Not.
Oh,
I wasn't sorry about that.
So hey.
She's extremely cute.
Like, put her closer.
Yeah, come on. Let her cook. What does she have to say about Gramsci?
How do we win hegemony, El? Well, with a face like that,
she's like, I don't know.
Actually, she did shake her head. She's like, no one knows.
Don't have it. Anyway, I just wanted to say that, like, it seems to me that, like, I think that there's good reason to think that the party is an essential tool, resource. Like, I'll put it in a negative form. Can we conceive of organizing sufficient power to like actually change things at the level of like relations of production or political representation without something like a party? Like, can we imagine something like that being possible? And I have a really hard time imagining that is. As like a partyless left here in the United States, it sure seems like this is an essential ingredient that's missing, it seems to me.
Some organizing mechanism.
I think that
people are going to be mad at me for not, like, I don't know, celebrating the DSA or something.
Well, that's not a party. I mean, that's the...
Yeah.
There's a way you could think about that as a part. Like, if you wanted to, I don't know. But if it was actually centralized enough to kind of have a coordinated strategy that was about maintaining some kind of political independence adjacent to or in the proximity of the DNC, like if there was a plan like that, like where you start having like medium term goals where you're thinking, okay, we want to amass our forces so that eventually we can, break off. When all this started happening in 2015, they used to call it the dirty break strategy. I haven't heard about that in a long time, but people have thought about these things, but because this kind of pragmatism of like dealing in that electoral system just like takes over people's minds like the body snatcher, it's very like within every 4-year cycle. Do you know what I mean? I feel like, oh my God, here's some radicals. Whoa, where'd they go? And then it happens every 4 years. There is something really institutionally inhibiting about the structure, and I think that it seems both very obvious and very counterintuitive to do anything other than what we are already doing, which is mostly the problem. But the second thing that like I wanted to say is I really feel like you guys are getting me hyped like against like political philosophy or politics as applied ethics. You remember that Goyce episode that we did?
Oh yeah.
This is my go-to text for that.
I really feel strongly about it. Like, I'm done. I'm really done with it. I don't want to do that anymore. Do not make me. Don't make me sit in a conference room saying how do we become activists or be more involved when you are doing this sort of thing. I'm out.
I mean, I was actually literally going to say, because, for our listeners who maybe haven't read Gramsci yet, if you ever do, read some stone cold, and I know everyone's going to, as soon as I say this, y'all going to be like, go there, Will. I'm not knocking all of analytic political philosophy, but read...
I am.
Owen is.
Like, let me make friends. Read, say, someone
what did we
like
just talk about?
John Rawls. No shade to John Rawls. Yes, I get it. He's part of the Black radical tradition.
I was thinking about him all throughout this.
Look at the form of the writing and what it is doing. Compare that to Gramsci. You can say it's different historical context, but I also think it's a fundamentally also different orientation of what the writing has to politics. I get it. John Rawls, reluctant socialist, stop adding me. Gramsci clearly feels as if this writing is also a participation in altering the balances of forces in his conjuncture. Yes. It's a fundamentally different type of writing, and I won't buy it if you tell me no. I won't buy it.
And I just think the brain rot in their heads is like, you know, I'm not speaking just about analytic philosophy, but I'm thinking about a kind of heavily academized, like, is that a word?
Absolutely.
I don't know.
We're kind of the philosophers. It's a word.
A conception of political philosophy, which would be like, oh, well, this is a manifesto. This is a program. Like, this isn't really philosophy. Like, it's too bound up with, like, you know, answering specific conjunctural questions, and practical questions end up infiltrating the theoretical questions, which should be able to be handled on their own. That's what, like, philosophers do. Even though Spinoza didn't do that, Hegel didn't do that, Plato didn't do that. All bullshit.
Besides that, it's not philosophy, though.
Besides that, he's like, no. What he says here, and he says it actually incredibly clearly. He says, quote, only to the extent to which the objective aspect of foresight is connected with a program, does this aspect acquire objectivity.
Oh, yeah.
Like, you actually only win objectivity, win a intelligible, concrete conception of the world and of existence through something that you want to see done in it. Whether you're going to do it yourself or not, or whatever. He's not saying every philosopher, every theoretician's a politician or whatever. He actually is very clear about that not being the case. The idea that, you know, he says, this is how you make your intuitions clearer. This is how you sharpen your intellect. It's through, like, it's a partisan vantage point. It's passion, you know, and, like, that is for me, like, just epistemological, almost like kind of meta epistemological point. Like, that's where I think the, like, real work is done.
And to be clear, and I love how all four of us, in one way or another, we're already arguing with the phantom bros who are going to come for us for one thing or another, who don't really listen closely to what we're saying. Gramsci isn't even talking about dogmatism, though. And so I could see, you know, someone coming and being like, well, actually, the great thing about analytic philosophy is we have no dogmatists here, which one? Okay, interesting.
Let me know. Interesting. Cool.
Enunciating this standpoint is always in relationship to those to whom you have a responsibility to. And so Gramsci also thinks if you have the intellectual vantage point, that's what allows you to be reflective on what is working and what is not working. What actually is germane to the situation, what is not. He's clearly not talking about being sort of fanatical and, you know, beating your head against the wall. He thinks that this is the only way you can be dynamic and self-reflexive rather than simply amorphous, quote unquote, neutral and non-committed. And so, you know, I think that that's also an interesting insight into what it also means to be a rational agent engaging with politics. And it turns out it's not just simply being, let's just, like, do thought experiments and not presume we have any stake in it. Let's just get some formulas out there.
Well, I think he defines Marxism at some point as that position in philosophy where you are responsible to and accountable to the working class and its interests, right? And, like, I like this definition. This is good, right? It doesn't have to do with any particular doctrinal commitment. It is like, no, is the work that you're doing, in fact, speaking to the interests of working people, or is it not? Because guess what? A lot of the stuff out there just ain't. It's doing something else.
And I think sometimes people think that's a virtue.
Yeah, I mean, I basically think it is. I do actually think that's pretty straightforward. I mean, I have a pretty simple definition of what Marxism is about, and it's pretty much like that. Like, it's an assessment of the world, you know, like how to get it to move. But then it's like, you know, it lands on the working class, and you're either in touch with those people and talking to them about their interests and doing stuff to mobilize them, or you're just doing some other kind of politics. And, you know, if you're doing some other kind of politics, it means that your assessment of the world is different, and then we can argue about that. But if you're in the Marxist camp, then the basis for analysis is like, are we going somewhere? Am I a leader with followers, or nah? And it sounds like, for the most part, the answer is no.
It's a resounding nah.
It actually, it's not that hard. It's not that hard to make these assessments. It's like, do I have people around me? Are we going to meetings? Are we having conferences? Do we have a voting strategy? Like, what are we doing? And if you're looking around yourself and you're like, I don't have any people, then, you know, you got to reassess.
physician, heal thyself.
Can I raise, again, what might be a question that's too big for this episode?
Are you asking me seriously?
Yeah, Gil, I was waiting for you to
yes.
answer and you said nothing, so I'm just going to keep going. The state. What is the concept or role of the state in Gramsci? So if I were to take a step back and put on my critical hat, I might ask, and I'm putting it this way so you all can tell me I'm wrong or something like that. But this reliance on the party, does this mean at the end of the day, because Gramsci doesn't describe more of where we're going, that the whole thesis of the withering away of the state, has that been dropped? Is for Gramsci the state, simply the fundamental organ over which, the party is struggling over, and that the state has no necessary connection to domination and capitalist relations? Because I wonder, someone might hear this and think, if the party, again, accounting for Gramsci's conjunctural situation, et cetera, if the party is fundamentally dependent on the state, what if the state is actually a fundamental barrier to long-term transformation? So, do you all have a sense of, does Gramsci see the state as an object to be struggled over, rather than simply the state is simply an expression or an instrument of class domination? So I guess that's what I was a bit confused about. I get that Gramsci thinks we should struggle within the state, but when we've read Lenin's just trying to give an explanation for why the state would die out. And it seems as if Gramsci's not there yet, and maybe that's for historical reasons or philosophical reasons. I couldn't quite tell. So is the state with us forever?
I don't think that he would say that.
Okay.
I think that, he talks, for instance, at some point in this about how one of the complicated, contradictory things about a revolutionary party, a revolutionary communist party, is that he says its perfection and its end, its completion is no longer to exist, right? It itself doesn't want to have to continue. Its continued existence testifies to the continued existence of an antagonistic class society, where the point of organizing in this way is to prepare the ground for the abolition of class society, in which I think he would say neither parties nor the state would need to exist. And I think he takes himself to be kind of Leninist on this position, but I don't know if you all have a different sense. But that's the way that it felt like to me, at least.
I think Gramsci's a Leninist for sure.
Yeah.
I think people try to wean their interpretations of Gramsci away from this with lots of theoretical fancy footwork, but I think the politics of it are Leninist. At the same time, I don't think this is an easy question to answer because, revolutionary parties have a number of contradictions they're trying to move through. I think the idea, after having reflected on this a little bit, is that the idea of the Revolutionary Party, if it's going to be something different than just a parliamentary party, or different than narrow trade union consciousness is what they used to call it, there's something that the party has to do to connect those organs to a mass movement. And that seems to be the Revolutionary Party's unique task. That's why you have this emerging debate about vanguardism. When Lenin says things, we're talking about the most advanced elements of the proletariat. These are the people who see the need to connect those tasks. They're ideologically ready, that they see it, they want to do it. This has all the usual problems that it does, but I do think that, I just want to leave here that the reason that I refuse to leave the corpse of the old left in the ground is, honest to God, people, give me a better plan. It's 100 years later and I don't see a better plan. No, for sure. I'm for real.
I know.
I'm not. I just honestly the people, horizontalism. We've been doing that for 30 years. I'm kind of on one today. I know. I'm sorry, but it's just I'm gonna soapbox it. Horizontalism. 30 years I've been doing that. We've had the biggest mobilizations in American history in 2020. We have all these people on the streets protesting various things all over the world. Millions of people in Chile came out to change their constitution. Okay, so people want some change, and we've been experimenting with ideas about this and spinning our wheels for decades. And I don't really care who I make mad about this. I'm sure I'm not Leninist enough for the Leninists, and I'm sure I'm too social democrat for the other ones. But if you can tell me who's got better ideas than what the old left was doing, I'm all ears. I really don't know.
Yeah.
That's my soapbox for the day.
And that's like a Gramscian point. If you can't, from your position of passion, position of one, I'm trying to use Owen's tripartite schema, from your position of passions, your desire to make change, but also the objective analysis of the state of affairs. If you can't see that, you're continually running aground, and the best you can say is, someday it will work out, Gramsci will say that you're fundamentally not committed to the art of politics, I think. And so we have to be, I think for Gramsci, we have to be willing to let go of things that are not working if it is true that we are committed to this goal of progressing society. Now, if you're more committed to the goal of such and such a tactic, then it actually makes sense why you might just remain committed to something that is not working. But, it strikes me that Gramsci is trying to say something like, we need to start thinking about what would allow us to develop a mass movement of, a change consciousness, change habits, but also the institutions that could effectuate all of that. And it seems as if we still don't have much better ideas for how to do that. We have ideas of how the world should change, but not how to bring that about.
Bring back the party.
Bring back the party. Yeah, is that the title of the episode?
I don't know.
Bring back the party with Gramsci.
Bring back the party with Gramsci.
Yeah, I mean, he makes this point about how like the ends, the goals are so incredibly important. And so this is the thing that worries me, I guess, about the kind of loose social movements that have emerged over the last while, is that you need ends. This actually speaks to some of the work you've done, Will, but like there needs to be the identification of a problem, a particular end, and then some like actual. Oh fuck! Hold on a second. I think.
Do we wait for Owen to come back, or do we finish his point for him?
We can finish this point, right? You work backwards from the ends to find means that actually make those realization of those ends possible. And there's just I think the point he was going to make is that so many of these inchoate movements are very, very unclear on what the end is, other than I don't know, bad things should stop. And I'm like, yeah, I also don't like bad stuff, but what are we doing?
I'm team no more bad stuff.
No more bad stuff. I'm with you.
It.
Yeah, stop it.
Or just the most maximalist program possible, just everything everywhere all at once, like that fucking movie, but in real life all the time. But this is the role of the program, and I think it's hard to cohere a program, to get consent behind it, and I do think it probably requires compromise. But what you need is not just long-term goals or short-term goals. I think sometimes I use the word medium term on this podcast. This is what I mean. Long-term goal, socialism. Short-term goal, get dude into office, form union, so on and so forth. Medium-term goals are how do I move the American labor, the Wagner system, from a firm-by-firm organizing level to a sectoral bargaining level? How are we going to... those are medium-term goals. And I think that there's this sense of urgency about what we need to do because we feel so urgent, climate change and everything else. There's just a lot to be urgent about. You just think it has to be everything at the same time. And I really wish that could work. I just don't think it can be everything at the same time, because we haven't gotten one thing at any time in 50 years. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So this is kind of what has made me more of a curmudgeonly reformer. It's not really because I don't want the big thing. It's because I need a W in my life, and so does everyone else.
Yeah. It's not a strong basis to build a counter hegemony, taking L after L after L. It turns out human beings, they get demoralized. Not me. I'm a masochist. Give me failure. God. I just try to fail better. Yeah. But I even think with Gramsci, he also puts on the table even if we accept bringing the party back, we also have to understand how difficult that project must be. And whatever he means by bringing the party back, I doubt it's, let's see if we can get the Democrats to somehow be the long-term organ of social transformation. This really requires...
You don't think so?
I don't know. I'm willing to be proven wrong again, but I take it, this is the last thing I'll say about it, is there has to be a sober understanding that there aren't silver bullets. That whatever the party would mean for us now, forget whatever Gramsci means, whatever would mean for us now, it's not going to happen overnight. And I think that's partially why I like Lillian's medium-term goals, because that keeps your horizons extended far enough ahead that you're not just accepting short-term, but doesn't get demoralized by the absence of the longer term. And so just understanding that the party won't arise overnight, and developing those sensibilities, those habits, that infrastructure, that's the hard work of politics, I take it, for Gramsci.
Yeah. All right, well, that does it for us today. New episodes of What's Left of Philosophy come out every 2 weeks wherever you get your podcasts. Also check us out on YouTube for videos and live streams. Before closing out today, we'd like to take a minute to thank some of the people who are supporting the show on Patreon. We couldn't do this without you, and we're really grateful. Today's new patrons are Clive Hogg, Nicholas Cook, Norman Bombardini, Tori Rare, Jesse Arsenal, Tino Mori, James Holland, Paul Spicer, Maddie, Laura Becker, Revelator, Derek Varn, Nick DK, Madeline Kinkle, Ryan Dorfler, Jackson, Mark Sinan Windrow, William Bell, Ted Ellsworth, and Joseph Clifton. Thank you all very much. If you too like what we're doing and want to support the show, please go to our website, leftofphilosophy.com, and click the support button. Patrons get access to exclusive content like locked episodes, bonus videos, and access to our Discord server. You can also buy some What's Left of Philosophy merch from the store linked on our site. Follow us on Twitter @LeftOfPhil, and don't forget to leave us good reviews and comments on your podcast app. With that, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
You're muted.
Bye. I'm so sorry, guys.